As a part of this series, today we're going to be talking about the focus. It's not, again, what we have, but who we are. But once we identify who we are, then the Bible does talk about what do you have. And so we turn a corner today. In the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about what God has given to you, what you have, your possessions, your resources, what it is He's given to you as a part of your life. And the opportunity we have today is that Chad Eichorn is with us, and he's going to be preaching today. I asked him several weeks ago to share on this particular Sunday in this series, because we're talking about the focus. With what God has given to you, what happens to that? And one of the things I've noticed across the years, Chad, is that in all the funerals I've gone to, when I follow the hearse or ride in the hearse to the cemetery, there has never been a U-Haul trailer behind it. You ever noticed that? Never a U-Haul trailer. You can't take it with you, as we say. But the fact is, what I have experienced is coming back in the ensuing weeks and working with families in the spiritual realm who are struggling with what to do with what has been left by their loved one, where there was no plan, no will, no nothing, and no plan for how it happens. And it's become a great burden on the family and becomes a tremendous thing that burdens a lot of families. And I've been with the families who had to struggle with that. And so this morning, I think it's an important part of our stewardship, and the Bible talks about it, and Chad's going to talk with us this morning about that. What plans do you have with what God has given to you, that when you're gone, you can't take it with you, but you can control and direct what happens to what you have that'll be bless the kingdom, bless your family, bless others into the future. And so Chad's going to come and share with us in just a moment. And Chad is not only an ordained elder in the Church of the Nazarene, pastored across the years, but came to Des Moines and attended Drake University and got his law degree there, and now practices law, and has been intentionally doing that to bring the giftedness and his training and the ministry together because he saw the need in the life of the church. And so I appreciate that kind of commitment and dedication that's been willing to do that. And as he comes to share with us this morning, not only has he been willing to just share with us this morning, but this afternoon, there's a few slots left. If you haven't signed up, there's a few slots left between 1 and 6 this afternoon that Chad has agreed to meet right here in the library in these time slots this afternoon for an consultation that's totally free of charge. His first consultation to talk about how you can prepare yourself and your family for the future. And Lisa and I are already signed up. We're going to be a part of that this afternoon. We need to update some things and think about what happens next with what God has given to us. And we're going to be a part of that. If you've not had a chance to sign up, there's a sign up back at the table. You can do that following the service. I encourage you to take advantage of Chad's expertise and his willingness to minister to us in this way. And so I encourage you to do that. And so let's listen to God's Word. Listen as Chad comes. Open our hearts to that. And begin to let God talk to us not only about the way we're living, but what will the resources that you have, how will they be used for the kingdom after you're gone? Chad, welcome. We're glad that you're here. All in one piece this morning. Amen.
All in one piece. For those of you that don't know, I took a little bit of a spill in my driveway on Thursday. Don't do that if you can help it. So, I was going to start off telling a joke about how cold it was all outside, but Leroy stole all my material. So.
Oh, wait, we have one.
No, please.
Chad,
we've heard
one
enough.
More.
Oh.
Yeah, I said I wasn't going to do this, but I lied.
Okay.
I heard, I don't know if this is true, that it was so cold that even the lawyers have their hands in their own pockets now.
Oh, man. See, finally a good one. Well, so several weeks ago, Pastor asked me to come in and talk to you guys today about a variety of things related to finances and what I do and sort of my story. And so I've been thinking quite a lot about how I was going to approach this topic and thinking through some of the scriptures that deal with this. And if you Google scripture and finance and Bible verses related to finance and things like that, it always comes up with the same several stories and things like that. And you know, when we were doing the capital campaign for the Forward in Faith, every month we'd put together the newsletter, and it would have a place for the Bible verse. And by the end of it, I was just like, which one am I going to recycle for this month? Because there's only so much in the Scripture that deals with this. And I've been thinking through some of the, instead of thinking, like looking for those specific sort of proof texted verses, I was looking for something a little bit different, and thought, you know, quite a bit about the Old Testament, because we talk a lot about finances. Jesus talks a lot about finances in the New Testament, and then in the Gospels about sort of resources and things like that. And there's some parables and things. But one thing jumped out at me particularly as I was going through things, and it's the story of King Hezekiah. Now, in the Old Testament, the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are in Genesis, and there's this sort of progression of the people of Israel into captivity in Egypt, and then their eventual release and freedom, and they're creating their own kingdom, and then eventually they sort of move into this time period where there are a variety of kings, and there are good kings and there are bad kings, and Hezekiah was one of the good ones. King Hezekiah, so the ones that we traditionally think about as far as the kings go, David is one that comes to mind. Solomon is one that comes to mind as far as good kings. And Hezekiah should be right up there. Hezekiah did all kinds of really great things. The Scripture describes him as a righteous king, and he sort of was the king during a very pivotal time in Israel's history. The temple had fallen into some disrepute when he became king. There was idol worship going on in the temple. He purified and rebuilt the temple, and he purged it and the countryside sort of together of a lot of the idol worship that was going on at the time. There was an attack by the Philistine army. He wiped those out, and he restored the Passover celebration. The Passover celebration had become sort of intermixed with idol worship, and so he sort of helped to sort of reclaim that. But then Hezekiah fell ill, and depending on how, it's sort of described in both the book of Isaiah and the book of 2 Kings. It describes his illness. It involves boils. It's very gross. You probably don't want to read about it. But at one point, Isaiah, who is the sort of chief prophet at the time, comes to him, and when he's befallen this illness, or when this illness has befallen him. And there's just one verse that sort of stuck out to me, and it's in 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 1. It said, "In those days Hezekiah became sick and was at the point of death. And the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz, came to him and said to him, 'Thus says the Lord, set your house in order, for you shall die, you shall not recover.'" It's very interesting. One of the most successful, sort of bronze medalist kings in the history of the people of Israel, even he, the prophet comes to him and says, "You need to put your house in order." And I've been thinking a lot about what I do and why I do what I do. And the more I've come to think about these things, the more I realize that my role in a lot of people's lives is helping them put their house in order. And how important it is that we have to put our house in order. We're talking about generosity and being future focused. Well, future focused looks more than just like, at some point when when Leroy's riding in the hearse to the cemetery, we have to be future focused not only for the end of our life, but for tomorrow, for what happens. And the impact that we can make is going to be connected to how we have set our house in order. So what does it mean for us to have our houses in order? I've been thinking about this, and it means we're going to be talking about generosity both today and next Sunday with our finances, but it goes way beyond that. And that's one of the things that during this January series that we do just about every year, where we're talking about our gifts and how sort of generosity is a pivotal part of our lives. Having your house in order goes beyond just our money. there are three things that we need to do in order to get our house in order. The first is managing our relationships. That might be the most difficult part of this whole process, because money is just numbers on a piece of paper. You know, whether there's a few numbers on a piece of paper or a lot of numbers on a piece of paper, they're just numbers on a piece of paper. It makes a difference whether or not you're going to eat at McDonald's or Sizzler or Ruth's Chris or where we're going to eat. But at the end of the day, we're still going to eat. And that's just sort of our finances. What's much more difficult is the relationships that we have. And we spend a lot of time talking about our relationships in church. It's both our relationship with God and our relationship with each other, and about how we can impact the lives of our brothers and sisters based on our how we express God's love to us to other people. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about our relationships today, and I'm also not going to spend a ton of time talking about our finances, because we're going to spend next week talking quite a bit about our finances and generosity. What I'm going to spend some time talking about today is our plan. So how do we plan appropriately for the future when we don't know what the future holds? So King Hezekiah, on his deathbed, he's got boil disease or some sort of horrible affliction that nobody would want to sort of be a part of. Isaiah comes to him and says, you need to put your house in order. Well, that's easy. If you're on your deathbed and time's short, I need to put my house in order, then it's pretty easy. You make a couple of phone calls, you ensure that your planning documents are in place, and you move forward with things. You sort of accept the fact that life is coming to an end. But the problem is we don't have that crystal ball. We don't know when the future is going to hold for us. And so in some ways, that's pretty terrifying. And in other ways, it's totally freeing. Because if you plan appropriately, it doesn't matter what the future holds. So, we're going to talk about, this morning, we're going to talk about what this looks like and then how we do it. So what I do in my job is help just talk to people through their situations in life and figure out what the right plan is for them. And there's no sort of right plan. It's just, what's your circumstances, and let's think through what could happen in your life and how we're going to deal with that. And so a lot of my job is estate planning. So just to back up, yes, I'm an attorney. No, I try not to be the kind of attorney that has my hands in other people's pockets. But the majority of my work deals with two things. It deals with estate planning. So that's helping people craft wills and trusts in order to appropriately plan for how their resources are going to get distributed at the end of their lives. And then elder law. And elder law is this sort of umbrella term that has to do with a whole lot of different things. It has to do with guardianships and conservatorships for people that have neurological conditions like Alzheimer's and dementia. It helps with planning for the need for assisted living or long-term care. How in the world are we going to pay for something that's so devastatingly expensive, and not, if dad's moving into a long-term care facility, how are we going to make it to where mom's not eating rice and beans every night because they're broke now? And then, sort of a little bit of other things, but I'm not the kind of attorney that's doing, a real estate dispute on Monday and then a criminal matter on Tuesday and then writing somebody's will on Wednesday. It's not what I do. I just have focused on one area. And that area is planning. So I'm going to talk about the couple of sort of the central pillars of estate planning today, and then why they're important and what they're going to allow us to do in the future. So in estate planning, what you're doing is you're looking at, and this is applicable for, well, first of all, who in here has an estate? Right? An estate is a castle in England, isn't it? That's what you think of when you think of an estate? Well, an estate, if you're 18 and you've got a car and a bank account, you've got an estate. It's just your stuff, right? It sounds fancy, and I'm sure that there are reasons for that, but in reality, that's all it is. Your estate just is what you have. And so the question is, how in the world do you plan for what you have? And so the primary thing that people think about when they're thinking about their estate planning is my will. What's going to happen to my stuff when I die? And whether that's $100 in the bank account and your car because you're broke and you're eating ramen noodles because you're in college, or whether you've lived your whole life and you've retired and you've put together some resources and you've inherited a piece of property and you've got more complicated things to worry about. That's the primary pillar that we have. And so the question then is, how do we deal with that? And all a will says is who's going to get my stuff when I die and who's going to be in charge of getting it to those people. And whether that's you're going to give it all to the children's hospital or the church or your kids or your best friend from elementary school or whoever it is, that's what a will does. It just says, this is who's going to get my stuff and this is who's in charge of getting it there. The other sort of side of things is your power of attorney documents. And what power of attorney documents do is they say, well, a will becomes effective the moment that you pass away. And so until that time, you don't really have anybody lined up to take care of things. If you're young, your parents are naturally the people that can make decisions for you. As soon as you hit 18, you have to give that authority to someone else. That if I'm incapacitated in some way, this is who's going to be helping me make those sort of determination. This is who's going to be authorized to talk to my insurance company and talk to the IRS and deal with my bank, things like that. So, or that's sort of the financial side of things. Or if I'm injured and in the hospital, this is who's going to be able to make decisions for me. And so that's the other side of things, is who's going to help me while I'm alive. And this is what that planning looks like. And so the question is, what kind of plan is right for each of us? That plan looks totally different whether or not you're, right out of college, whether you're 40 years old and you've got kids at home, whether you're in your 60s and your kids are grown and now you've accumulated some assets, whether you're in your 80s and now you may be looking at downsizing or you've already downsized and the reality of long-term care. That's very rude, tapping you on the shoulder like you're in your 80s. Unbelievable. An estate plan is not a one-size-fits-all document. And it's not even a one-size-fits-your-life permanently document. It's something that lives and breathes. Because as your life changes, the requirements for your planning change. So the how of getting your plan in place is very important. So for a younger person with a young family, a will is probably appropriate. For a older person that has sold their land or real estate, a will is probably appropriate. If you've put together some resources, one of the things that a lot of people explore is a trust. And what a trust does is it takes your real estate out of your name, puts it in a separate sort of entity, and then when you pass away, you don't have to go through probate. And probate is what a lot of people are looking to avoid because it's long. How many of you have ever been through a probate before? Anybody? Nobody? Wow, lucky ducks. So probate is the method by which the court directs a person's resources moving to the next generation. So if you pass away, if I died today and I had my house just held in my name as an individual, the only person, and Sarah died as well, so it's not transfers between spouses. The only person that can say who can direct your assets from you to another person is a judge. So you have to open an estate. So this is why when you hear about probates and estates, they take a year or more to go through. It's incredibly complicated. It's expensive. So a lot of people are looking to avoid probate. And so in Iowa, in order to avoid probate, if you have real estate, you have to put it in a trust. And so a lot of people think about trusts and they think about rich kids from California, right? Well, that's not at all what we're talking about. It's a kind of plan that allows people to avoid probate. And so all that to say, your plan looks different given the different circumstance of your life. So that's just a little sort of 30,000 foot view of estate planning. Now, the other side of what I do is that elder law planning. And that's, what in the world are we going to do if we need long-term care? And that can hit a variety of people in a variety of different ways. If you're dumb and your driveway is slightly icy and you slip and fall and you break your hip, which I thought I did, I've got a nice bruise that you don't want to see it because it was like up here, and I don't think that'd be appropriate. But it's the size of a softball, and it's pretty healthy. But if you fall and break your hip and you need long-term care, how in the world do we plan for that now? Because what we're called to do is we're called to be good stewards of our resources, right? So the question is whether we've been blessed with a massive inheritance, or we didn't receive anything from our parents, we put together a little bit of resources on our own, or we don't have hardly anything at all. God's called us to do well with what we have. And you can't do it without a plan. Planning is vitally important. One of the things that I love, and we're going to talk about finances. Pastor Stephen's going to be going through the Dave Ramsey course about financial management. It's so important that you have good, clear understanding of how we're going to manage our resources and have a plan. If you don't have a plan for what you're doing, you're just going to, you're not going to be able to treat your resources like the gift that God has given us. I love my wife very much, and I drive her absolutely insane. Correct? Was that? Sometimes? Yeah, okay. One of the things that drives my wife the most insane is when we talk at some point during the day, and I say, do we have a plan for fill in the blank? What's the plan? What's the plan? Whether it's, what are we having, like, what's the plan for dinner tonight? Or, we've got this, and this on the schedule because our kids have busy lives. What's the plan? And I think that she thinks that I'm looking for like an hourly breakdown of, at first, dinner's going to be at 5:30, and then at 6:15 we're going to do the dishes, and then at 6:30 the kids are going to start getting ready for bed, or we're going to take Walker to basketball practice, or this, that, and the other thing. I sort of am looking for that. That's the difficult part about things, because in order for me to maximize the time that I have in a given night, I need for there to be a plan, because it allows me to appropriately allocate that one resource, that time, in order to accomplish the goals that I have. So plans are very important. Now, how many of you have ever made a plan and had it not come to fruition? Everybody, right? Well, that's part of life. But unless we make the plan, the likelihood of the plan coming together is relatively low. How many of you remember the 1980s? How many of you remember my favorite television show from the 1980s? The A-Team. Wonderful. I loved the A-Team. The A-Team was a show where these four guys that were in the military at some point are being hunted by this goofball that's also from the military, and they go from town to town creating or helping people get out of jams. They would create they'd armor their van up, and the army guys would shoot at them, and they would shoot at the army guys, and no one would ever shoot anybody. It was the most violent, least accurate 1980s TV show I've ever seen. But at the end so they'd go through this elaborate plan, and the good guys would win, and Hannibal, the head guy of the A-Team, would stick a cigar in his mouth, and he'd say, I love it when a plan comes together. Right? You remember that? I love it when a plan comes together. I love it when a plan comes together, and I hate it when they don't. Because when I'm helping people with their planning, we don't know what life holds for us, but if we don't plan or we plan poorly, it can turn into an absolute disaster. Leroy brought it up earlier. Well, I had a family that, I'm going to give you an example of a good situation. It's not a good situation, but it's a situation where things are going to turn out all right for these people. I did the planning for them about a year ago. They're a wonderful family. Their names are Floyd and Renee. They had retired. Floyd had worked. He had put together a business during the course of his life. He was an engineer or some similar sort of trade. Wound up employing a bunch of people, became very close with all of his employees. It was a sort of a small family business. He wound up selling the business to a larger thing, so he retired. He had put together enough money to live a very comfortable life. They were just moving into that sort of retirement phase in their life. Everything was great. They had some family move up from Texas to relocate here. They had kids and grandkids living in the house with them. Everything was great. And this past week, I got a call from Renee that Floyd had gone into the hospital because he had a fever and they couldn't really diagnose it very well. And then while he was in the hospital, he arrested and they were able to do CPR on him and bring him back. And he was actually up and walking around, and then took another decline and wound up dying very suddenly in the hospital, very unexpectedly. But they had come in and we had been able to do effective planning for them. We had been able to organize their interests in a way that she was going to be able to finish up the final details related to the sale of his business, and everything was going to sort of effectively transfer from one spouse to the other after the passing of the first. And she had a peace of mind knowing that even though this was a terrible, terrible situation, things were going to be okay. Because they had organized themselves, they had good kids, they had people there that were going to be able to help out with things, and it was fortunate that it was a well-crafted plan. Had they not come in, they were going to have to go through a whole, probably a 2-year-long process that would involve the finalization of the sale of the business. The courts were going to have to be involved. It was going to be devastatingly expensive. It was probably going to cost them between $40,000 and $50,000 to go through this whole process. We were able to do it for much less expense. There was going to be much less expense associated with it, and it was just the right thing to do. Now, let me give you an example of when we don't plan. When you don't plan well, then a situation like, and I'm just going to use, John and Jane. John Doe and Jane Doe. They came into my office, or I should say their kids did. John and Jane Doe were a wonderful, wonderful couple. John and Jane Doe did not plan well, and they downloaded a do-it-yourself sort of trust document from the internet because they had some assets. They had about $700,000 in assets before all this started, and John was a wonderful guy. John was successful at work, but relied heavily on his wife. Jane did everything, because John, while he was a wonderful guy, sort of useless at home. He didn't balance his checkbook. He didn't cook dinner. He didn't do his laundry. He didn't. There was nothing that he did. He was totally reliant on his spouse for everything. Does that sound familiar to anybody? I mean, my wife probably thinks the same thing. Under a very terrible circumstance, his wife died suddenly. And so what did John do you think? John ran right back out and got remarried because John couldn't cook his own meals, couldn't do his own laundry, couldn't balance his own checkbook, and he was totally reliant on his spouse. And because they had a wonderful relationship. And so John and Jane had kids. They were very good kids. They were sort of private, and so they didn't talk a lot about some of this stuff with their kids. And then John ran out, and he married Susie. And John said, well, I was able to trust my wife. She's my wife. I can trust her. And so John, made his wife part of his estate planning. He named her as a co-trustee of the family trust. And the trust was very poorly written. And so what happened was John, several years later, developed Alzheimer's and then became incapacitated and then didn't have any idea what was going on. And his kids didn't know how to talk to him about these things. And so they never had any conversations about it. And then because Susie was not Jane, Susie did not have the same priorities and certainly did not have the same morals. And what Susie was able to do, because of how poorly they had planned, was go in and change the trust and named her kids, Susie's kids, as the beneficiaries of the trust. And so John and Jane's resources that they had put together with the full intention of leaving to their children went to somebody else's kids. And they were essentially disinherited because of this. So you have to be exceptionally careful with how you put your stuff together. You have to plan. When you put your house in order, you have to know what kind of order you're putting your house in. Now, the impact of that not only had to do with their finances, but that impacted the relationships. Because ultimately, like I said at the beginning, money is just numbers on a piece of paper. All money does is facilitate experience. So the reason that you pay $3,000 for a mattress isn't to have a $3,000 mattress. It's so that way you can have the experience of sleeping on a $3,000 mattress. Now, I don't know, I don't have a $3,000 mattress, but I assume it would be like sleeping on a cloud. But, it's one of those things that you're paying for the experience. And so having your house in order, having your house in disorder will create the experience of discord. Your finances will be in discord. Your relationships will be in discord. You're going to leave your kids a hornet's nest. One of the worst family fights I've ever seen was about something that was not worth $50. These two brothers loved their grandfather dearly. And their grandfather passed away, and he had a fishing pole. And that fishing pole, he had promised one of the brothers at one point and the other brother at a different point. And he died and didn't say who the fishing pole was going to. I don't have any idea if he knew how important the fishing pole was, but these two brothers went for 40 years without talking to each other because of this fishing pole. And I know it sounds hilarious, right? That something so stupid could cause that much discord. But these two guys got their noses out of joint and disaligned with each other, and they refused to talk to each other. And the whole reason I know about it was because I was talking to one of the brothers about doing his estate planning. He was in his 60s, and I said, "Okay, well, tell me about your family." "Well, I don't have any kids." "Well, tell me about who else. We're talking about decision making. Who would you want to make decisions for you if you were in an accident?" "Well, I've got a sister and a brother." "Well, tell me about your sister." "Well, she lives in Washington State." "Well, she's probably not going to be a good choice to be your medical power of attorney." "Tell me about your brother." "Well, he lives 20 miles away." "Well, he sounds like a good choice. I haven't talked to him in 40 years." "That's a long time. Why haven't you talked to him in 40 years?" "Because he got a $10 fishing pole." Right? It's the most insane thing, but by not recognizing what you have and not planning appropriately with it, it's going to create issues that may have generational effect on people. And so you have to plan clearly and appropriately. You have to get your house in order because it goes far beyond money. It goes to your relationships. So why do we do the things that we do? Why it's so important to have our houses in order is because it's going to impact our relationships with God, with ourselves. Having a plan is important. And having disorder is not great, right? How many of you have seen the show on Netflix it was just put on Netflix? Sarah, I can't remember what it's called. It's the Marie Kondo, what's it called? Tidying Up? Tidying Up. Have you seen the show? It's wonderful. So she's this very, very sweet Japanese lady, maybe 30 years old, it looks like. Who knows how old she actually is. Very just tidy looking person. And what she does is she goes into people's homes that are particularly disorganized, and she goes in and she'll pile all the clothes on the bed and make them sort them out. And it's like you get to watch this family purge these years and years of clutter in their lives and come out the other side and have organization. And that organization is what allows us to make a difference. It's the difference between having life being something that happens to you and you planning and living your life. Our planning is the same way. It's going to allow us to do things. So our generous living is future focused, but we can't get to the future without appropriately planning for it. You have to be intentional about things. One of my favorite parables that Jesus sort of uses in Matthew is the parable of the talents. So the master goes away and he leaves talents for his servants to manage for him. One of the servants, he gives 5 talents, and one of the servants, and we've heard the story before, right? One of the servants he gives 2 talents, and one of the servant he gives 1 talent. The servant that he gives 5 talents to invests it well and returns, it doubles his investment by the time the master gets back. And the same thing with the guy that has 2 talents, and then the one that has 1 talent buries it in the ground and then gives it back to him and says, see, I didn't lose your talent. And then, we oftentimes focus on the story about the gentleman that has or the person that has 1 talent. Or we focus on the master, because if you remember the story, the master comes back and he says, oh, good job, person that had 5 talents, go out and invest. I'm going to put you in charge of all these things. Same for the person that had 2 talents, and the person that had 1 talent, he's like, well, you didn't lose it, but you didn't even invest it, so I didn't even earn any interest on it. So hit the bricks, and he kicks him out, which is it seems like a particularly harsh thing to do for not even screwing up. He just didn't do anything with it. But that parable has to do with our intention. Are we going to take the bull by the horns, as it were, and do something with what we've been given? And the question is, what are you going to do? And if all you do with what you've been given is sort of like, well, I'm just going to bury it in the ground, and at some point I'll worry about it, and you're going to wind up in disarray, because what happens is by not effectively planning, it's much easier for disaster to strike in a way that we don't anticipate. And we're not doing right by our families, and we're not doing right by God by not planning appropriately for our future. One of the things that I've seen people do that has been particularly effective at, has made a tangible difference in the life of the kingdom is their planning. Odella Swenson, was that her name, Dan? We went to church in Ames forever. Whenever I grew up in Ames, Mom and Dad just moved down here from Ames. There's a sweet old lady named Odella Swenson, and I remember her vaguely as a child. And I sort of grew up, and I knew that she was older and she had stopped coming to church, and I assumed that she just couldn't make it out anymore. And I didn't really, it's one of those people that when you're young, you sort of lose track of and you forget about. And I must have, was I in college when that happened, when the gift happened? So it must have been like 10 years since I had seen her. I hadn't really thought about her much. And the church gets contacted by an attorney that says, hey, you're going to be receiving a check. You were a beneficiary in an estate. And the pastor's like, oh, that's great. I wonder who did something to it for us. And Odella Swenson, in her estate, and the church was really struggling at the time to be able to pay the bills. Out of the generosity and sort of thankfulness for her, for the work that the church had done in the community and in her own life, left the church almost $250,000. And for a small church in a town like Ames, that's life-changing. And so but without her good, clear planning, that wouldn't have happened. Because if you just leave it up to, they'll figure it out. Well, they'll figure it out isn't good enough. And so we can make a tangible difference in the life of each other and the life of the church by clear, appropriate, organized planning. It's so vitally important that we do it. So one of the things that I'm doing, and by the way, this isn't a sort of a plug for me. I'm not trying to drum up business or anything like that. I just want to be available. At any point, anybody that wants to come and talk to me about their situation, I never charge people for meetings and things like that. I always say, if I'm going to do work for you, I'll charge you for it, but I'm not going to charge you to just sit down and talk through what your issues are. If you think it's weird to use somebody at church to do your planning, I totally understand that. Just get it done. It doesn't matter who does it, because the disarray that your family will experience by not having good planning done can be just ruinous. It's disastrous. But if we heed the words of the prophet Isaiah and come to the end of our life with our house in order, you can make such a tremendous difference in the lives of the people that you love and in the life of the church. So my challenge for us all is get your house in order. Kings need to do it. The person sweeping the king's floor needs to do it. Every one of us needs to have our house in order. I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you guys. I love our church. I love the family that we have, and I want you all to have your house in order. If there's anything that I can do to help with that, let me know.